Welcome to Twists of Life, where every story has an unexpected turn. Stories of joy and sorrow, hope and redemption, just like the life we all live. Make yourself comfortable. It's time to begin. Slowly treading the dusty, narrow street, David approached a small provincial town with a name unfamiliar to his ear: Severovo. He had arrived here on company business, first covering the airspace to the regional center, and then a couple of hours of shaking on a suburban train. The journey was long, but David did not complain. From childhood, he had a passion for travel, and therefore even business trips were perceived as exciting adventures. Usually, his business routes passed through large cities. The company where he held the position of chief economist specialized in the sale of household appliances. It was an extensive, thriving network, spreading its branches throughout the country, and it only expanded every year. And so, David found himself in Severovo to settle key issues related to the opening of another store in their network here. Everything went well. The issues were resolved, the necessary papers signed. David was used to handling such tasks. Tomorrow morning he was due to return, first by commuter train to the regional center, and from there by plane home to his native Petrovsk. Yes, the central office of the large company was located precisely there, and this decision turned out to be very far-sighted. The evening was free, and David decided to devote it to a walk around the town, to look around, see the local sights, perhaps find a cozy cafe and spend some time there. Severovo appealed to him, a quiet, peaceful town. Life here, probably, flows slowly, measuredly. In such places, as a rule, everyone knows each other. Unlike bustling megacities, here, probably, good neighborliness is still alive. People gather together, communicate. David was almost certain. If he turned into one of the local courtyards, a picture from the past would appear before him. Elderly people on benches, leisurely discussing the news, a noisy gang of kids in a sandbox, men busy repairing someone's car, women who had finished their household chores, chatting by the entrance or near the front garden. All this vividly reminded David of his own childhood. Every summer, for at least a week or two, his mother would send him to stay with her former in-laws, his father's parents. How the boy looked forward to those days. His mother and father separated when David was very young. Of course, he could not remember that period, but his mother harbored a strong resentment towards her ex-husband, believing that he had left her for a new passion. With this woman, he subsequently moved to distant Vladivostok, where her parents lived. So, he couldn't leave her parents, but he abandoned us, his family, his mother would exclaim bitterly. She often returned in her memories to that difficult time. And your father doesn't need his own son, nor his own mother and father. He completely lost his mind at the sight of a pretty face and long legs. It was unpleasant for David to hear such words about his father. But on the other hand, his parent really did not show himself in his life in any way. He had other children in Vladivostok, apparently a son and a daughter, meaning David's brother and sister. Apparently, his father had enough of these heirs. He was clearly not drawn to the elder one. Or maybe the new wife was against contact with the child from the first marriage. Who knows? He transferred alimony regularly, but he did not participate in his son's life at all, never even congratulated him on his birthday. But his paternal grandmother and grandfather lived relatively nearby, about 100 kilometers from Petrovsk, in a large village. They waited for their grandson every summer, and David's mother, it seems, did not object to these meetings. But she treated her in-laws with great caution, probably fearing they would turn her son against her or speak well of her ex-husband, their son. Therefore, the boy stayed with his relatives for only a week or two a year during the summer holidays. And those were truly happy days. Grandmother and grandfather waited for their grandson all year, preparing for his arrival. For those 2 weeks, all their attention was focused only on him. David literally bathed in warmth, love, and care. Delicious lunches and dinners, fishing trips with grandfather, overnight stays in a tent in the middle of a field, swimming in the river with the local kids. If it were up to him, he would spend the entire summer in the village with his grandmother and grandfather, and they would have been just as happy. David knew this, but he had to be content with little. At least this was something. Incidentally, neither grandmother nor grandfather ever said a bad word about their grandson's mother. On the contrary, they instilled in the boy that it was hard for his mother alone, and the son should help her. But his parent often spoke quite unflatteringly about her in-laws. They couldn't even raise their own child properly. They never left the village their whole lives, and they speak ungrammatically. And sometimes grandmother and grandfather would tell their grandson about the childhood of their son, David's father. Usually, these were funny stories that made the boy smile or laugh loudly. They reminded him of stories like those in Arthur's stories. David laughed heartily at his parents' pranks, and sincerely couldn't understand how such a guy, cheerful, brave, knowing how to make friends and take risks, could abandon him, his own son. Did he not even think about him? Was he not interested in how his firstborn was doing, what he had become? Later, David learned that his father had tried to keep in touch with his son for a while. He called, asked to speak to him, sent postcards, toys. His mother, out of resentment and a desire for revenge, did not give her ex-husband the slightest chance. She herself told David about this when he had already grown up. This happened on the day the young man learned of his father's death. He, a man not yet old, was taken by a heart attack. David barely knew this man, but the feeling of an irreparable loss crushed him then, like a concrete slab. Yes, his father did not participate in his son's life, but the young man assumed that in the future they would still meet, talk, sort everything out, maybe even start communicating. And now nothing could be fixed. Absolutely nothing. It was then, on that day, that his mother spoke well of David's father for the first time in her life. It turned out that when the young couple had a baby, the inexperienced young mother was afraid to bathe him. The young father handled this perfectly. He also got up to the child at night, seeing how exhausted his wife was during the day. And he ran to the milk kitchen, standing in line for hours after work. But she also told about his father's attempts to communicate with David. Yes, he wanted to contact you, his mother confessed, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. But I was so offended by him. Well, and I sincerely believed that nothing would work out. He's in Vladivostok. We're here, on the other side of the country. We wouldn't be able to see each other often anyway. Instead of tearing your heart out and missing him, it's better not to know such a father at all. David forgave and understood his mother. He felt sorry for her his whole life, in fact. She raised him alone, dedicated herself entirely to him, never remarried. Thanks to her efforts, David became who he is now, a wealthy and very successful man. From an early age, his mother instilled in her son that he was obliged to get a higher education. She herself had graduated from a vocational school and worked as a seamstress in an atelier near their home her whole life, often taking orders home. David liked listening to the whirring of the sewing machine. He could watch his mother work for a long time. It was interesting to see this amazing transformation. Just a moment ago, there was just a piece of fabric on the table. A little time passed, and it was transformed beyond recognition. Now it was a beautiful skirt, a summer dress, or a robe. His mother was almost a real sorceress. By the way, this work brought the small family quite good money. In childhood, David was not denied anything. He always had fashionable clothes, beautiful toys, a bicycle, interesting books, ice cream almost every day. And they lived with his mother in a good apartment, where everything necessary was available: comfortable furniture, household appliances, even decorative figurines. Once a year, mother and son definitely went to the sea. David felt like a quite happy person. "Study hard, son," his mother instructed her only child. "You'll study, get a higher education, become a big person, then we'll live well." The young man thought they were living quite well, even now. But he listened to his parents' words, of course, especially since he always enjoyed studying, and it came easily to him. He was almost a straight-A student throughout his school years. University life completely captivated David. At university, he met very interesting people. Student parties, trips to nature, preparing for exams together, and then celebrating the end of the semester. All this resembled a colorful carousel. David felt happy. He was in his element. His mother was a little scared by all these parties. She often warned her son against thoughtless actions. "Be careful, son. You know you need to be cautious. Everything is good for you now. A wonderful future awaits you, but it's very easy to lose everything, very easy." Then followed lectures on the dangers of alcohol, the possibility of getting into trouble or being beaten, the danger of getting too carried away with parties and failing the next session. And his mother was also scared of greedy girls, who, in her opinion, of course, dreamed of getting pregnant by promising young men and thereby ruining their lives right at the start. David was amused by these maternal fears. The son perfectly understood and controlled himself. The young man tried to calm his parent, explained to her that he had a head on his shoulders, but she could not understand that her son had grown up, become almost an adult. It still seemed to her that she had to protect him, lay straw wherever possible, be nearby. David, remembering his student years, smiled. His mother is still the same, always worrying about her only son, always trying to arrange his life. Now his parent has a new obsession. Her son, a grown, established man, is already approaching 40, and he is still unmarried. This is not right. His mother persistently tried to set up her long independent son with the daughters of her friends and acquaintances, good girls from decent families. It was funny, and at the same time incredibly awkward. David was not angry with his mother. He treated her concern with indulgence, understanding. His parents simply wanted the best for her son, in her understanding of best. David himself was quite happy living as a bachelor. Is it bad? You're only responsible for yourself. You do what you want. You don't report to anyone. But you couldn't explain that to his mother. David, of course, had short-lived romances from time to time. Some of his partners tried to ring the gentleman, but nothing came of it. David firmly stopped such attempts and immediately broke off the relationships. He didn't need a family. Why? What if he didn't turn out to be a good husband and father? There are few happy couples. Mostly everyone is constantly arguing, sorting things out, dividing something. And look how many divorces there are. Adults can't figure things out among themselves, and then the children suffer. No, David didn't want that for himself, and it wasn't easy either. Once, many years ago, David was sure he had met the love of his life. These were sincere and very strong feelings. David felt then as if the whole world had transformed, become brighter, friendlier, warmer. And then came disappointment and almost physical pain. The young man didn't want to live. He barely pulled through then, thanks to his mother, by the way, who found a good psychotherapist. It's scary to think what could have happened if not for that specialist, who, incidentally, turned out to be a professional in his field. No, David didn't want such upheavals anymore, so he consciously chose a life in which work occupied the central place. True, his mother still couldn't come to terms with this. She wanted to see her son arm in arm with a wife, surrounded by cute little ones. But never mind. She would survive somehow. His feet carried David to the station square. This was not surprising. In small towns, all roads lead to the station. Well, he could have dinner somewhere here. There was surely a suitable cafe nearby, or maybe even a canteen. For some reason, David suddenly craved home-style food, the kind you could only find in canteens. Just then, as if on cue, his eyes fell on a sign. Canteen. David walked quickly towards the eatery. He needed to cross the square with a fountain. It was by this fountain that a rattling, dry, and cracked voice stopped the man. "Young man, it's awkward to ask, but there's no other way. Please, help if you can." David turned around and saw an old woman, hunched, wrinkled, dressed in an old faded dress, a colorful scarf on her head, dusty worn-out sneakers on her feet. But her eyes, the blue eyes clearly belonged to a woman who wasn't that old. They looked timid and somehow guilty. Perhaps she was a beggar, the same age as David's mother. Just this way of life had aged her, turned her into a hunched old woman. "Of course." The man nodded and began rummaging in his pockets. Had he brought cash? David usually paid with a card, but this time he found several thousand-ruble bills. Without hesitation, he immediately gave them to the woman because, well, it was clear that she was very much in need. There was so much hope in her gaze. The old woman didn't look like the brazen professional beggars. "Is this all for me?" the stranger asked in surprise, seeing the bills in David's hand. "Yes," the man nodded. "Thank you, dear. God grant you health for your generosity and kindness. I'm not asking for myself, you understand." David wanted to continue his path, but he saw that it was important for the old woman to explain herself or even justify herself to him, and so the man was not in a hurry. Let her speak. It was not difficult for him to listen, and it would make the person feel better. "I have a grandson, Stephen. His mother, my daughter, died, so I'm raising him as best I can. We don't have enough money. I can't work anymore. I've become old and sick. I have to ask for help from kind people at the station. Don't think I'm asking for drinking money. And I'm not lazy. I've worked hard my whole life as a cleaner. If not for the illness, I'd still be working now, wouldn't need help. But I can't. For Stephen, for his sake, I only go with an outstretched hand. He's growing. He needs to be fed well, clothed, educated." "Ah, you have a hard fate," David shook his head. "You're great for not abandoning the boy. How old is he, Stephen?" The old woman smiled. It was clear she enjoyed talking about her grandson. "He's 12. Handsome and smart, learns easily. He has a clear head. But he suffers because of our dire situation. He sees how hard it is for me and tries to earn money. Sometimes he washes cars in the parking lot. Sometimes he mows lawns for people. He gets pennies, or sometimes nothing at all. People are different. They often cheat boys. And he spends a lot of time, comes home tired. Then there's no time for lessons. So his studies are slipping. I tell him, 'Study, Stephen. Your main job now is studying. You don't need to work so much, I'll manage. And you need to study, to get on your feet later.' But he doesn't listen to me. He doesn't listen." "He doesn't listen," David repeated. The story somehow touched him. The man wanted to know more about the life of the old woman and her grandson. "Is it hard for you with him?" "No, what are you saying?" the beggar woman exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "You misunderstood. Stephen is a very good boy. He takes care of me, does everything around the house. He only doesn't listen to me in the sense that he continues to work. It's hard for him. My heart aches for him. Stephen should be in a good family. He's talented. He would make something of himself, and I'm afraid he'll ruin all his abilities with me. That's what I'm worried about." With these words, the old woman adjusted the scarf on her head. When the woman raised her hand, the sleeve of her calico dress lifted slightly, and a bracelet appeared before David's eyes, a thin gold chain with 3 heart-shaped pendants. The man stared in astonishment at the exquisite piece of jewelry. No, he was not struck by the mere fact of an expensive item on the wrist of a poor old woman. It was just that many years ago, he had ordered exactly the same bracelet from a jewelry workshop for a girl he considered his soulmate, with whom he wanted to live a long life and grow old in a cozy house somewhere by the sea. And she, this young beauty, became the biggest disappointment in his life. There, on those heart pendants, their names were engraved, David and Catherine, and the third heart was inlaid with a diamond. David had spent all his savings on the jewelry then. What was this? Just a similar bracelet? Or that very one? It wouldn't be difficult to find out, but it felt strange, almost scary. The old woman caught David's gaze and smiled. I know what you're thinking. She pretends to be a beggar, but she wears gold. But you're mistaken. This is a memory. My daughter's memory. In the hardest times, I couldn't part with this thing. Catherine loved this bracelet so much, it meant a lot to her. That's why I haven't taken it off since that terrible day. Since Catherine... It was as if David had been doused with a bucket of ice water. His heart first squeezed, and then began to beat at an accelerated rhythm. His temples pounded, colorful spots blurred before his eyes. Catherine. The girl with whom David wanted to tie his life, for whom he had ordered the bracelet then, her name was also Catherine. So, could it be? No, that simply couldn't be. Do you have time now? David asked. Yes, the old woman replied. She looked at the man suspiciously, who had first easily given her a huge amount of money, in her understanding, and now was acting so strangely. Why? We need to talk, David said. I think I once knew your daughter. This bracelet, and her name. Everything fits. Maybe we can sit down? All right. The old woman nodded and headed towards an empty bench in front of the fountain. David shuffled after her. David met Catherine during the summer holidays, before his final, 5th year. He had come back to the university, which had become like a second home, for mandatory work experience. The building had just been renovated, and students were washing paint off the corridors along with a professional crew. Catherine was part of this renovation crew, a fragile, large-eyed girl. David noticed her immediately. Cheerful, pure, bright. There was something so captivating in her gaze. The young man constantly tried to catch her eye. When he succeeded, Catherine would blush and lower her lashes, and David felt happy. His heart would sweetly skip a beat every time he was near this wonderful girl. And this happened often. David intentionally lingered nearby. It was surprising that no one else noticed Catherine's unique beauty. Not even Chris, David's classmate, the recognized local Don Juan who never missed a beautiful woman. He didn't pay any attention to Catherine. Well, all the better, because Chris knew how to handle girls. A few words, and any beauty was his. David didn't want Catherine to become one of Chris's trophies. Seeing Catherine dragging a heavy bucket of water, David dropped everything and was by her side. Give it here. The young man snatched the heavy load from Catherine's fragile, graceful hands. Where do you need it? To the 2nd floor. The girl didn't argue. On the way, they started talking. Catherine turned out to be a simple and modest girl. It was easy and pleasant for David to talk to her. Catherine, it seemed, also liked the handsome, smiling young man. The students' work experience lasted a couple of hours, while the renovation crew worked a full day. On the day they met, David stayed with Catherine, helping her until the end of her shift. He didn't want to part with her, even for a few hours. After the girls' workday ended, the young people went to the cinema. David held Catherine's hand in his and knew that right now his life was taking a serious turn. Nothing like this had ever happened to him before. No other person had ever meant so much to him. David and Catherine started dating. Gradually, The young people became closer to each other, getting to know each other more intimately. Both were raised without fathers. Catherine had never known hers, and it seemed didn't worry about it at all. Both had only mothers. But while David's mother did everything to ensure her son had a higher education and a prosperous, happy life, Catherine's mother didn't have such an opportunity. She worked as a cleaner, earning pennies. Catherine helped her from an early age. After ninth grade, the girl went to a construction technical school. She didn't even dream of higher education. I need to work. Money is needed. No time to sit around in auditoriums. After finishing technical school, the girl got a job in a renovation crew and finally started earning a salary. Now there was more money in their small family, and this was very timely, as mother and daughter had to rent an apartment. They had no place of their own, and prices were rising quickly. So they lived. They didn't starve, it seemed, but their funds were only enough for the bare essentials. David was sure that he and Catherine would get married. He saw no other fate for himself. Catherine was completely his person, so sensitive, so kind and fragile. David wanted to protect and cherish her. She had a hard job. When they got married, Catherine wouldn't do this, wouldn't carry heavy buckets, wouldn't breathe paint fumes. No, David would have a good profession. Consequently, he could count on a high-paying job. The husband would fully support the family. And Catherine could do whatever she wanted, manage the house, raise a family, or go back to school. Of course, David shared his thoughts with his mother. He was generally used to telling her everything. "Have you lost your mind?" His parent, hearing her only son's revelations, was horrified. "How many times have I told you this? You're a young man from a well-off family, a student at a prestigious university with good prospects. We have a large apartment after all. Do you even imagine that girls from poor families are hunting for guys like you? Do you know how many are eager to ride into a comfortable life on someone else's back? No, Mom, Catherine, she's completely different. You'll understand everything when you meet her. You understand a lot. There will be tons and tons of Catherines instead of this Catherine in your life. What wedding? You need a completely different girl, from a good family, with a higher education. And these provincial girls, they only want one thing. They'll have a child by a good guy. And then, manipulating the child, they'll wrap him around their finger. And his relatives, by the way, too." No matter how David tried to convey to his mother that Catherine was a completely different matter, she didn't want to listen. In the end, the young man decided, come what may. Even if his mother didn't agree with his choice, he would still do everything his own way. True, the wedding would have to be postponed now. His mother would never agree to David bringing his wife into their shared apartment. She was set against Catherine. So, living together would lead to nothing good. There was only one way out. Get on his feet as soon as possible, earn money for separate housing, and only then propose to his beloved. Without Catherine, David couldn't imagine his life anymore. Next to her, he felt strong, almost omnipotent, and at the same time very vulnerable. A strange feeling. His heart belonged to Catherine. She could do whatever she wanted with him. But the girl treated David very gently, took care of him, constantly tried to make him laugh. And when Catherine rested her head on the young man's shoulder, in those moments, he felt like the happiest person in the world. The offer of an international internship came unexpectedly to David. He was just finishing his diploma work. Graduation was just around the corner. Finally, the young man would have his diploma in hand. He could work, earn money. David planned to start saving for housing immediately. Even if it was a small apartment in an old building somewhere on the outskirts for now, the main thing was that there would be a place where he and Catherine could start their family life. Quiet, calm, measured, and undoubtedly very happy. One day the rector summoned David to his office. It turned out that a foreign partner was offering the university a profitable contract. They needed smart graduates, students. He would have to spend 3 years in a foreign country and work hard. But the salary offered was such that a young specialist couldn't find it in the city. David immediately calculated in his mind. This money would be enough for a very decent apartment, and the experience gained abroad would increase his demand as a specialist. Upon returning, David would easily find a high-paying job. Of course, the young man gladly agreed. True, he would have to part with Catherine for 3 long years. They wouldn't see each other. They would have almost no opportunity to communicate, only perhaps by correspondence. And this for a whole 3 years. A monstrous term. On the other hand, it was the only chance to get on his feet quickly. He had to endure, survive this separation. This was the real test of feelings. David was sure that they would both pass it with dignity. Before leaving, David wanted to give his beloved a special gift, something memorable, something she would look at and remember him. It was then that the young man went to the jewelry workshop. He decided to order an exclusive piece of jewelry for his beloved, something no one else had. Together with the master, the young man decided it should be a bracelet, elegant, fragile, like Catherine herself, with original heart-shaped pendants, with engraving. On 2 of the heart pendants, David asked to engrave their names, and the third the master decorated with an exquisite stone, a diamond. The master quoted the sum for materials and work. It was all of David's savings. But the young man parted with them without any regrets. The bracelet was ready within a week. David, seeing it, sincerely admired it. Yes, it was exactly what he wanted. Not just a trinket, but a piece of jewelry with meaning and special energy. Catherine's eyes lit up with joy at the sight of the gift. True, she immediately became embarrassed. This must be incredibly expensive, a gold piece, and custom-made too. You deserve the best of everything, David smiled, and you'll have all of it when I return. Let the bracelet remind you of me in my absence and bring you joy. I won't take it off at all, Catherine promised, and hugged her beloved. His mother, unlike Catherine, received the news of her son's internship with joy. What a smart boy you are, she smiled proudly, looking at David. After all, they offered this internship specifically to you, not just anyone. That means they value you, and the trip will be good for you. You'll get that poor little bride out of your head, and your brain will be back in place. David didn't argue with his mother then. No, he wouldn't forget his beloved girl for a minute there, in a foreign land. Moreover, this whole internship was only for her sake. Without the trip, they wouldn't get their own place so quickly. And this way, David would soon be an independent man, ready to start a family. He would have to work hard for happiness. And David worked tirelessly. It was hard. He had to deal with complex financial reports, overcome the language barrier, learn everything anew. But David managed. He had a goal, and he was moving towards it with confident and firm steps. The young man often called his mother, dialing her from the office or the hotel reception. She was so happy with these calls, showering her son with compliments and questions. But with Catherine, he had to correspond. She didn't have a landline phone at home, so David had nowhere to call to talk to his beloved. He missed her voice so much. He started longing for it almost immediately after leaving. The correspondence was also short-lived. After a couple of months, letters to the girl stopped arriving. David himself wrote almost every week. But did Catherine receive his messages? Probably not. Otherwise, she would have definitely replied. "Mom, do you know what happened?" David wondered during a phone conversation with his parent. "Do you know why Catherine isn't answering my letters?" "How would I know?" his mother replied reluctantly. "Maybe your flighty girl is messing around with someone? They're like that. You're not telling me something. I'll drop everything tomorrow and fly home. I need to make sure she's okay. Don't you dare. His mother was frightened. Everything's fine with her. She's waiting for you. It's just that there are problems with international mail right now, temporary issues with international communication in our country. That's why letters aren't getting here. And they're not going from here either. So don't worry. Just work calmly. It was hard living without any contact with his beloved during those years. His mother spoke reluctantly about Catherine, preferring to steer the conversation to other topics. When her son insisted too much, she would report some facts, saying everything was all right. Catherine was alive and well, working. David often asked his mother to arrange a phone call with Catherine. He wanted to hear her familiar voice, to know how his beloved was doing. But his parent was adamant. "No Catherines will be in my house," his mother invariably replied. David was angry with his mother but understood that she had the right to say and think that way. After all, it was her apartment, and she wasn't obliged to let in a person she couldn't stand. David had no doubt. When he returned home and married Catherine, his mother would have to meet the girl. And then his mother would see, would understand what a wonderful person Catherine was. She would accept her. She would definitely change her opinion of her. That's how it would be. The sooner the better. 3 years of internship on the one hand flew by quickly. David had a lot of work, many complex and interesting tasks. This was engaging and brought in good money. On the other hand, 3 years without his beloved seemed like an eternity to David. He missed Catherine's voice, her eyes, her smell, her touch. She appeared in his dreams. He saw her in girls he met. David didn't look at anyone else during this time. Although he had options, there were many young female employees at the company who were not against starting a relationship with a hard-working, smart young man. But David only thought about Catherine. He didn't need anyone else. His mother, by the way, hoped that her son would find a decent girl in the new place. She often asked David if he had met anyone. He had to disappoint her every time. Why would he need anyone else? Catherine, she was his destiny. The internship period was nearing its end. David had accumulated enough funds. It was enough for a very good apartment in Petrovsk, with money left over for a car. In the week before his departure, David wandered through local supermarkets, choosing gifts for Catherine, a beautiful dress, unusual jewelry, even toys. It was pleasant to guess what would bring joy to his beloved. His mother met David at the airport. She had changed a lot over the 3 years. She had gained weight, had more wrinkles, and more gray hair. David was happy to see his loved one. Mother and son hugged tightly and went home. "You've grown up a lot." His mother didn't take her eyes off her son. "You've become a real man. So handsome, so tall." David smiled. He felt the same way. Youth was behind him. He had become a completely adult person, fully ready to start a family. The man and his mother didn't talk about Catherine anymore. Why? Any mention of that girl always made his parent lose her temper. The young man was in a hurry to get home. He couldn't wait to leave his things, take a shower, and rush to her, to Catherine. Surely she wasn't home right now. The day was in full swing. Catherine was most likely at work. Then he would ask her mother where to find the girl. David couldn't wait until the end of the workday. He had dreamed of this meeting for 3 whole years. He wouldn't last even a few more hours. He needed to see her, hear her beloved voice, look into her familiar eyes. "Are you going to see her?" his mother asked David when he was already near the front door. The young man didn't deny it. "To her." "Well, good luck," his parent said with a scornful twist of her lips. David had never been to Catherine's place, but he knew the address well. He had walked her to her building many times. The girl lived on Zavodskaya Street, in a former barracks. It was a 2-story, leaning wooden building. The disadvantaged area had become even more neglected over the past 3 years. Mountains of garbage around, dusty unpaved paths, weeds growing everywhere. David climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor. Here was the right door. First, he pressed the doorbell, but realizing it didn't work, he knocked resolutely. The door didn't open immediately, about 2 minutes later. Standing on the threshold was an elderly man in a greasy robe with a sharp, unkind gaze and patchy gray hair. Who was this? Catherine had said she lived with her mother. What was this old man doing here? "Good afternoon," David greeted politely. "I would like to speak with one of the residents of this apartment." "He's before you in person," the man smiled proudly. "What did you want to talk about? I won't invite you in. My grandchildren are here now. They're sleeping. I wouldn't want to wake them." Of course," David quickly agreed. An elderly man? Grandchildren? Maybe he had the wrong door. "So, what's the matter?" The elderly man was waiting and seemed to be losing patience. "You see, I'm looking for my girlfriend, Catherine. Perhaps I have the wrong apartment, but she definitely lives somewhere nearby. Somewhere close. Can you tell me? Your neighbors, apparently. Catherine." The man shook his head. "Catherine and Eleanor. Her mother? Yes, they lived here. But they left somewhere, and in a hurry. This is my apartment after all. They rented it from me. I don't know why they suddenly packed up so unexpectedly, as if they were running from someone. Well, it was convenient for me. My son had children born, twins right away. So we moved here. This apartment is more spacious after all. They left. And you don't happen to know where or why?" "No, they didn't report to me. And I didn't ask. I don't need unnecessary information. I'm not used to prying into people's lives at all. The mother and daughter packed their things in one evening, paid me, and that was it. From their conversation, I understood that they were going to another city somewhere. Which one exactly? I don't know." David realized then that he had lost Catherine. Lost her forever. But the young man didn't give up immediately. He started a whole investigation. He even went to Catherine's former workplace, found her friends there, talked to them. They knew nothing about where Catherine and her mother had gone. She hadn't talked to them about her plans. Catherine became strange back then, long before this departure. Susan, Catherine's colleague and friend, readily shared her memories. At first, she was very sad when you flew off for your internship. Then suddenly she became somehow joyful. But it was a quiet joy. She glowed from within. We thought, did she fall in love with someone again? But she denied it. Something was definitely happening with her. I know her well. Then something happened again. Catherine was pale, scared, confused. I tried to find out what was wrong, if I could help her with something. I felt sorry for her. But you couldn't get a word out of her with pliers. And then suddenly this departure. Nothing is clear with her, in short. Having learned nothing from Catherine's acquaintances, David went to the police with a statement about the disappearance of his beloved girl. They just laughed at him there. They explained that Catherine and her mother were adults and could move freely around the world without notifying anyone. Maybe she ran away from you? A young man in uniform smirked, looking at the bewildered David. She doesn't want to communicate anymore, and you don't understand words. So she left. It happens. You're not a relative of mine. I can't accept your statement. There are no grounds. After some time, David lost hope. He realized that he would never find Catherine in the vastness of the huge country. His beloved girl and her mother had never had a place of their own, so they could easily move to any city. Trying to find them was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But why? Why did Catherine do this? Did she really fall out of love and run away? Or did something happen in her life? What difference did it make now? It was clear they would never see each other again. And that's when the young man fell into despair. while he was running around the city, doing something, searching, hoping. It seemed to him that everything was still fixable. But now David knew. Catherine had disappeared forever. His plans for a wedding, children, a long life together were not destined to come true. Then what was the point of the internship? What was he saving money for? Why did he leave at all? David suddenly realized that he didn't want to live at all. What was the point? Catherine wasn't there anyway, and of course, she wouldn't be. David now reflected on the reasons for her disappearance from morning till night. He lay in his room, the door closed, listening to sad music and thinking. Maybe Susan was right? Catherine met someone else? Or simply couldn't wait for her beloved for so long and left to find a new life because it was unbearable to stay here? In any case, she easily erased David from her fate, didn't even leave him a note or a message. She could have sent it through the same Susan, or through her mother, his potential mother-in-law. Did this mean David meant nothing to her? Catherine was the whole world to the young man, the meaning of his life, and he was just an acquaintance to her, someone nice to spend time with. He didn't want to live. David ate almost nothing, didn't answer numerous calls, didn't talk to his worried mother, who kept trying to reach her grown-up child. "Why are you suffering? What are you worrying about?" she asked. Well, the girl didn't wait. It happens, and it's very common. She went on with her life. You go on with yours. This is a normal situation, and you're making it a universal tragedy. Perhaps his mother wanted to alleviate her son's condition, but her lamentations only made him feel heavier at heart. Mother? She didn't understand anything. She simply couldn't look into David's heart and understand what was going on there. And there was so much pain, so much despair and black hopelessness that David couldn't imagine how to continue living with such a burden. In the end, his mother found a psychotherapist for her son. This happened after he refused food for 2 whole days. The woman couldn't even get David to touch food. That's when she got truly scared. Scared that her son would simply die. A short elderly man in a simple black t-shirt and jeans came to their apartment. He was probably just over 50, with noble gray hair at his temples, strong horn-rimmed glasses. His mother had called a specialist to the house because she understood that the chances of her son voluntarily going to a clinic were minimal. David had no idea how much effort it cost his mother to arrange this visit, and money, by the way. This man, he just sat nearby and said something in a low voice. David didn't listen at first. Then he became interested. The psychotherapist somehow miraculously helped him. Apparently, he was a professional in his field. After several sessions, David felt like a completely different person. He understood that life goes on even without Catherine. There are many more interesting and important things in the world. It was selfish and foolish to spend time like this, in sorrow, lying on the bed and doing nothing. The girl's disappearance was her choice and right. No person is the property of another. If she wanted to, she left. She knew where to find David. If she had even the slightest desire, Catherine would have already shown up. It cannot be said that David felt happy. No, the longing for his beloved was still very strong. But at least he had the strength. The young man realized that it was time to act. Look for a job. Somehow get settled in this life. The psychotherapist advised completing the course of treatment at the clinic, but David refused. He felt that he had already received enough help. Now he would manage on his own. Getting a job was not difficult. With such experience and track record, David was hired as a senior economist at a local household appliance trading company. The salary was immediately more than decent. The young man was also promised career growth if he proved himself. And David planned to prove himself. He planned it big time. He had to somehow distract himself from sad thoughts. If he stopped, the black melancholy would drag him back into its swamp. The young man felt this. David worked hard and quickly achieved success. Life gradually turned from black and white to color. First dull gray, then bright, full, juicy. When there is money, the world acquires a special attractiveness. David could now afford a lot, and did. Trips to exotic corners of the planet, vacations at expensive resorts, beautiful cars. And girls, of course. A young, handsome, wealthy man naturally had no shortage of choice. His mother seemed happy for her son at first. She had truly feared for his life then. The sight of an indifferent man spending days on the sofa behind the closed door of his room frightened the woman. But years later, David's overly free lifestyle began to bother her. "You need to get married, son." The man heard this phrase from his mother more and more often every year. But he couldn't agree with his parent. David was fine as he was. He felt free and almost happy. Serious relationships. He had been through that and certainly didn't want to repeat. If you love someone, get attached to someone so much that you can't breathe without that person, you become very fragile and vulnerable. David still remembered the pain Catherine's disappearance caused him. No thanks. That's enough. Love, serious relationships. In David's mind, all this meant the end of freedom. A person in love no longer belongs to himself. The object of his feelings can do whatever they want with him, even wrap him around their finger. Therefore, David, at his age, didn't even think about marriage. And there was still plenty of time ahead. He wasn't even 40 yet. He would manage somehow later if he wanted to. His mother scared him with lonely old age, and the fact that he, David, would have no one to give him a glass of water before death. This argument did not convince the man at all. He jokingly replied to his mother that he wasn't sure if he would even want to drink at such a moment. And it was foolish to give up a happy bachelor life for a vague prospect, especially since he had plenty of female company. David tried not to remember Catherine, but she still periodically surfaced in his thoughts. Sometimes she appeared in his dreams. Sometimes he saw her in girls walking towards him. The man learned to cope with his emotions. He didn't completely erase the girl he once loved from his heart, but now Catherine didn't prevent him from living and enjoying life. David managed to leave her in the past. At least, that's what he thought. All these memories and thoughts flashed through David's mind at the moment he was walking with the old woman to the bench in front of the fountain. The man saw the bracelet, and in an instant, all his feigned nonchalance evaporated. He felt again that he still longed for Catherine, and clearly realized that he would give away all his wealth and easily part with his notorious freedom just to have her by his side. But the old woman had said that Catherine was no longer alive. David was even afraid to think about it, hoping that he had misunderstood something or that there had been some mistake. "So you say you knew my Catherine?" The old woman looked at David attentively. "Yes," the man nodded. "This bracelet, I think I recognize it. Can I look closer?" The old woman silently took the jewelry off her wrist and held it out to David. All this time, she didn't take her eyes off him. The man's breath caught in his throat when the bracelet was in his hands. It was it. It was the very one. There was no doubt. An exquisite, original piece. And yet, David looked closely at the heart pendants. Yes, that was right. On 2 of them, names were engraved, and the 3rd was adorned with a diamond. "I am that David." The man handed the bracelet back to its new owner. "I gave that bracelet to your daughter many years ago." "So this is what you look like." The old woman shook her head. "Catherine was so in love with you then. Nothing like that had ever happened to her. She was flying on wings. I told her not to get involved with people like that." "Like what?" David didn't understand. "Sons of rich parents." "Rich? We weren't rich then. My mother raised me alone, just like you raised Catherine. But still, you weren't our equal. You studied at university. Your mother earned well, and considered everyone poorer than her not a match for her son. Maybe she was right, I don't know. Only one problem. She went against your love with Catherine. I don't understand anything. David really wanted the face of the old woman, Catherine's mother, to soften a little. She was clearly offended at David. But for what? He had gone away for that internship for the sake of his happiness with Catherine. He had worked there for 3 years, from dawn till dusk, earned money for an apartment, wanted to propose to his beloved, but couldn't find her in Petrovsk, and then couldn't even find a trace of her. It was Catherine who disappeared, Catherine who ran away from him. You don't understand? The old woman's eyes seemed to see right through David. It was a carefully studying gaze. Well, maybe you've forgotten, or you didn't know anything? David just shrugged. I looked for her, the man said. When I came back, I looked for Catherine everywhere. I went to your place, but completely different people were living there. I tried to find out something about Catherine at her former job. I even wanted to file a missing person report, but they refused. No one could tell me where Catherine had disappeared to. No one. Did you talk to your mother? The old woman clarified. Yes, she wasn't aware either. David understood from the words and expression of his interlocutor that his mother was somehow involved in this story. Nothing could be changed or fixed now, but anxiety rose in his heart. David was worried. His heart seemed about to leap out of his chest. Was he about to learn the truth? The truth he had sought for so long once? The old woman fiddled with the bracelet on her wrist and looked somewhere into the distance. Her gaze was slightly clouded. She must have been transported to the past, reliving some important events for her. David wanted to snap her out of this stupor. It was important for him to know the truth, to hear Catherine's story as soon as possible. All these years, the man had lived in the firm belief that he had left the situation in the past. He had fun, enjoyed all possible pleasures in life, worked hard, and now a chance encounter had changed everything, brought to the surface feelings and emotions so long hidden even from himself. David felt lost and vulnerable again. He felt physical pain again from the impossibility of taking Catherine's hand, of looking into her eyes. It was important for the man to hear about what had happened after he left the country as soon as possible. But the old woman sat, her lips stubbornly pressed together, and looked into the distance. And David didn't dare disturb her. She was an elderly woman. She had experienced something very terrible and difficult. He had to give her time to collect her thoughts. Catherine, she loved very much. You were the most important person in the world to her. The old woman finally began her story. I noticed right away that something was wrong with her. She started staying late at work too often, and she would come home so joyful, glowing all over. It was immediately clear to me that it was about a young man. I didn't pry into my daughter's life. I knew when the time came she would tell me herself. I only asked her to be more careful. I thought someone from her crew had started courting her. But it turned out like this. Eleanor raised her daughter alone. She was originally from a village, but Eleanor didn't want to live in her small homeland. The girl put a lot of effort into breaking free from there and settling in the city. It didn't turn out exactly as she had initially dreamed, of course, but it was still better than living in the village civilization. Eleanor planned to enter a technical school after school. Nothing worked out. It turned out it wasn't such a simple matter to become a student even of a not particularly prestigious vocational school if you had no connections or money. Eleanor didn't pass the competition, but wasn't too upset. She would stay in the city anyway. She had money for the first time. Her parents had provided it. Pennies, of course, but her mother and father had given their daughter everything they could, and Eleanor appreciated that. The money was enough to rent a room in a dormitory. And then the young girl got a job as a cleaner in a small shop in the courtyard. She had known how to handle a mop since she was little. The work was familiar to her. That's how Eleanor got her own source of income, and quite a good one compared to village salaries. The following year, Eleanor tried to enroll again and again failed. The girl cried then, despaired, and decided, well, it's not meant to be, probably. So let everything go as it goes. She had a job, she had housing, even if it was rented. So she would manage somehow. Years passed. Eleanor grew up, and from an awkward teenager, she turned into a pretty young woman. Men started noticing her. Eleanor began to think about a family. She wanted to take care of children and a husband, keep the apartment clean and cozy, cook delicious meals for her household. You wouldn't try especially hard for yourself. Cook rich cabbage soup, bake pies. It was different with a husband and children. You would always want to please them. And then a suitable candidate came along, Arthur Sidoroff, a loader at the store. Handsome, cheerful, never discouraged. Of course, not an oligarch, but then Eleanor wasn't a princess. The girl was well aware that a professor's son or a young millionaire wasn't in her future. But with Arthur, you wouldn't be lost or bored. He was also from the village, so they had a lot in common and interesting things to talk about. Arthur was practical and reliable. With him, it was like being behind a stone wall. Arthur didn't make her wait. He quickly proposed to his beloved. They had a purely symbolic wedding, without a procession of decorated cars, a crowd of guests, a toastmaster. They didn't have the money for that. But Eleanor did have a white dress, not a lush floor-length one, without a veil, just a light, pretty snow-white sundress. The young couple, with a couple of friends and the bride's parents, sat in a restaurant, celebrated the event in a small circle, and went their separate ways. Arthur had been an orphan since he was 12, raised in his father's sister's family. The boy didn't get much love and attention there. They raised him until he was of age and, with a sense of duty fulfilled, pushed him into independent life. So the young man managed as best he could. Eleanor dreamed that now their happy life would begin. Together, it would definitely be easier to get by. They could do it. They rented not just a room in a dormitory, but a whole separate one-room apartment. They could afford it with 2 salaries. Arthur made far-reaching plans. He intended to buy his own home. Eleanor looked at her husband with hope and pride. If Arthur said they would have their own apartment, then that's how it would be. He wouldn't talk nonsense like that. Only, the newlyweds' plans were not destined to come true. Arthur tried to earn a penny wherever he could. He worked odd jobs at construction sites as a laborer and helped unload railway cars at the station. He didn't get enough sleep, didn't eat enough. When his wife, feeling sorry for her husband, persuaded Arthur to give up another part-time job, he would just smile. When we earn enough for an apartment, then I'll lie on the sofa in front of the TV after work and annoy you. But for now, that won't work. Eleanor felt sorry for her husband. She saw that he was very tired, had lost weight. His face was gray from lack of sleep, with dark circles under his eyes. The young woman's heart sensed that this would not end well. And so it happened. Trouble struck at night, when Eleanor was fast asleep at home. Her husband had gone to another odd job. He was supposed to return in the morning but didn't come. Eleanor became worried and went to the station. She knew that Arthur was supposed to be unloading a cargo train. That's where they told her everything. It turned out that Arthur had already finished his part of the work. He had even been paid. The man was going home, but for some reason walked along the tracks and didn't hear the approaching train. And the engineer, in the dark, noticed a person sitting on the tracks too late. It's unclear why he was sitting there and didn't move. Didn't he see or hear the train? Wondered the worker who told Eleanor this story. But Eleanor understood everything. Arthur was simply very tired, completely exhausted. Perhaps he fell asleep there, right on the tracks, didn't make it home, sat down for a second to rest, and passed out. So Eleanor became a young widow. She grieved heavily over the loss of her husband. Along with him, her hopes for a strong, large family, her own apartment, and old age with her beloved person by her side disappeared. And during this difficult period of her life, Eleanor suddenly realized that she was expecting a child. The news made the woman happy and upset at the same time. Happy because Arthur, it turned out, hadn't disappeared without a trace. He would live on in their child. This news upset the future mother for many reasons. Firstly, Arthur hadn't had time to find out that they would have a baby. This was bitter and hurtful. He would have been so happy. He would have glowed with joy. Secondly, how would she manage alone? Eleanor's salary was barely enough for herself, and now a baby. That was quite a situation. After crying from joy, anxiety, and a whole bunch of other emotions overwhelming her, Eleanor pulled herself together. She would manage. It was okay. She wasn't completely alone. She had parents in the village. They would help. But her husband's death was not the only blow fate had prepared for Eleanor. Her parents, Eleanor's mother and father, a tragedy also happened to them. There was a short circuit in their old house. The wooden dwelling ignited like a match, and Eleanor's parents couldn't get out. They both died. Eleanor couldn't believe that all this was really happening to her. First her beloved husband, now her parents. No home, no loving and loved ones nearby. Eleanor was left completely alone in this uncomfortable and, as it seemed then, hostile world. The young woman didn't want to drink or eat. She automatically went to work simply because she was used to it. She ate, it seemed, even talked to someone. But during this time, it seemed to Eleanor that what was happening around her was just a terrible dream, not real. Sometimes people appeared to her as actors, and houses, furniture, trees, other details of the surroundings, as cardboard decorations. Eleanor herself seemed to see herself from the outside. There were no tears, only a persistent heaviness in her soul. Sometimes panic would suddenly surge, making it difficult to breathe. Eleanor would gasp for air, colorful spots blurring before her eyes, gradually obscuring the world around her. Then it would pass, and a strange apathy would set in again. Eleanor lived like this for about 2 months. The feeling of total loneliness and uselessness became almost habitual. Before, her parents and husband loved her, and Eleanor accordingly doted on her loved ones. And now? Why was she even alive in this world now? The woman began to have bad thoughts. What if she ended this meaningless existence? It wasn't difficult, well, why should she stay here? For what? For whom? It was precisely at this difficult moment for Eleanor that she felt the first movements of the baby under her heart, cautious, timid kicks that no mother would mistake for anything else. Eleanor had almost forgotten she was pregnant. So much had fallen on her. But she wasn't alone. Her baby, Arthur's child, would be born soon. Perhaps he would look like him? Eleanor hoped for this very much. From then on, the woman pulled herself together. She suddenly clearly realized that she would soon be a mother. This meant she had to hold on for the baby's sake. A child! He was innocent of anything. He was so fragile, so vulnerable. He needed someone to lean on in this crazy world. And that person would be her, Eleanor. The woman seemed to wake up from a deep, terrible dream and set about her affairs. There wasn't much time left before giving birth. She needed to solve many more issues and problems. Firstly, shake out the insurance money for the burned house. This amount should be enough for the time Eleanor couldn't work, if she economized, of course. Secondly, she needed to get all the necessary documents at the women's clinic. Thirdly, it was time to start gathering the baby's layette. A child needed so many things: a stroller, a crib, diapers, undershirts. All these tasks and worries distracted Eleanor from heavy thoughts. She began to enjoy life again. The woman eagerly awaited the birth of the baby. She wanted to look into the familiar face, see the familiar features of her husband and parents in it, feel that she was no longer alone. Eleanor, in her desire to save as much money as possible for her maternity leave, worked until late in her pregnancy. She washed floors, doing the only thing she was good at. She had to carry heavy buckets of water, bend down, reach. As a result, labor began a little earlier than expected. Eleanor didn't expect this. Nothing foretold it, as they say. Anyway, an ambulance was called for the young cleaner right at work, and from there, she went to the maternity hospital. Several hours of torment, and her treasure, a tiny girl, was placed on the chest of the new mother. The baby looked strange. She was wrinkled and somehow purple. The tiny one was immediately taken to the premature infant ward. For some time, Eleanor didn't know what was wrong with her girl. The doctors didn't say anything definite, brushing her off. Anything can happen. What do you expect, mother? You didn't carry her to term. The senior nurse answered all of Eleanor's questions irritably. They don't take care of themselves first, and then they suffer. What Eleanor went through during those days until her baby's condition stabilized. She had never been so scared. The woman prayed for only one thing, that her girl would survive. Everything else was unimportant. If there were any health problems, it was nothing. They would manage everything. The main thing was that the baby lived. Eleanor definitely wouldn't have survived another loss right now. And Catherine survived. Moreover, she was discharged from the hospital as a completely healthy child, without any diagnoses. Only her low weight reminded of her prematurity. Eleanor thought she would fatten her daughter up, but she remained fragile, almost transparent. However, this looked even beautiful and touching. Catherine, as Eleanor had hoped, greatly resembled her father. She was just as clear-eyed, smiling, charming. At times, Arthur's features showed so clearly in the baby that it seemed to the woman as if her husband himself was looking at her. This made her feel warmer and lighter inside. It was hard for Eleanor alone with a newborn baby in her arms. Until Catherine was 2.5 years old and went to daycare, Eleanor couldn't work. Money was only enough for the bare essentials: apartment rent, food, minimal clothing. Sometimes Catherine would get sick, and then they had to spend money on medicine. Eleanor's savings were rapidly dwindling. State benefits were minimal. And yet, the young mother felt happy. She had a daughter, a wonderful girl, smart and beautiful, her pride and joy. Eleanor felt needed and loved again. They say that other people's children grow up quickly. Eleanor saw for herself that this statement also applies to one's own offspring. Time flew by with dizzying speed. Here Catherine was already going to kindergarten. From a tiny baby, she had turned into a princess girl with fluffy pigtails. A scene change, and Catherine was a first grader. Eleanor still remembered crying at the school assembly, sending her daughter to school. She felt sorry for the child. Now a lot was required of her baby, sitting through long lessons, doing homework. And what if Catherine had mean teachers who would scold her? Eleanor had exactly those in middle school. Catherine, on the other hand, was glowing with happiness at the assembly. She couldn't wait to grow up, become an adult and independent, to help her mother. The girl saw how hard it was for Eleanor, how her back and legs ached after work. A few more years flew by like a fog, and now Catherine was a high school student. The girl wasn't very good at studying. She tried. Eleanor saw this, but nothing worked out. The woman wasn't upset and certainly didn't scold her daughter. Neither Eleanor herself nor Arthur could boast of academic success. So what was there to be surprised about? The main thing wasn't that. Catherine grew up kind, sensitive, attentive, and very wise. In practical terms, in her teenage years, she already knew how to economize and could prepare a delicious dinner or lunch with a minimal amount of money. This was more important for life than the ability to solve complex equations. And what a beauty Catherine turned out to be. Slender, large-eyed, fair-skinned. Boys turned their heads after the girl. Catherine herself didn't notice this, but Eleanor saw it and was proud of her girl. If only she got a good husband. That meant a lot to the woman. Catherine graduated from the construction technical school and got a job. Her crew consisted mostly of young girls like herself. Nothing complicated was required of them, just cleaning up the sites after the workers had finished. Eleanor was happy for her daughter. Yes, Catherine's job didn't require high qualifications. The pay wasn't that attractive. But at least Catherine was employed, and her work wasn't that physically difficult and exhausting. And then Catherine fell in love. Eleanor understood this immediately by her daughter's eyes, by her mysterious smile. Later, Catherine herself confessed that yes, there was such a young man. Wonderful. His name was David, and they seemed to be getting serious. When Catherine described her chosen one to her mother, she became thoughtful. He was out of her league. A student at a prestigious university, the son of a quite wealthy mother. Catherine wouldn't fit into such a family. Catherine was beautiful, of course, and hard-working, but the levels of the groom and bride were too uneven. But Catherine assured her mother that everything would be fine with her and David. It seemed the young man was sincerely in love with the young beauty, even talked about marriage. True, first he wanted to acquire his own housing, and for that, he needed to spend several years abroad. Even then, Eleanor suspected something. She didn't like it. It seemed to the woman that David was just fooling her daughter, would play around for a bit and leave, go abroad for fun, forget Catherine, and she would wait for him and suffer alone. She was naive, believed everything, so simple-hearted. And so David left, and then it turned out that Catherine was expecting his child. What a surprise. Eleanor insisted on terminating the pregnancy. She didn't believe David would acknowledge the child. And the two women couldn't manage on their own. They barely made ends meet. Most likely, the young man had already forgotten about Catherine, and she naively believed he would be thrilled with the news. Foolish child, Eleanor shook her head. I told her to give up her fantasies. David hung on to her every word. But my daughter stood her ground, said you would be happy to hear such news. True, my girl didn't know how to tell you everything. Your phone was unavailable. You didn't answer letters. All this convinced me even more that you had simply run away from Catherine and cut all ties. I didn't know who was involved in all this. I only guessed later. Everything finally fell into place just now, after talking to you. I wrote to Catherine, too. I wrote often, David choked out. There were problems with communication here then, but I wrote her letters every evening, and she was the one who didn't answer. No wonder, Eleanor smirked. Your mother, she apparently intercepted your and her letters, didn't let you communicate. She really didn't like her future daughter-in-law, the simple girl. How do you know? David breathed out. I guessed. It's a pity it wasn't sooner. But wait, you'll understand yourself soon. Just listen. Receiving no response from her beloved, Catherine decided to talk to his mother. Of course, your mother wasn't thrilled with this meeting. Upon learning of Catherine's pregnancy, she became furious. First, she yelled at my girl, accusing her of trying to deceive everyone to fleece the guy's wealthy relatives for money. Then she threatened to take the child, as he would be left with a mother who had no money and no place of her own. Of course, the child would be given to the prosperous father, and Catherine would be deprived of all rights to her son or daughter. David's mother said many hurtful words to Catherine. She stood there half dead with fear. Catherine was seriously afraid for the child then. She already loved him and was afraid of losing her little one. And what if David's mother really carried out her threats? What if she took the baby? It was then that Catherine realized she needed to leave the city, far away from this terrible woman who seemed capable of anything. And David? He, as it seemed to the girl then, wouldn't support her anymore. According to your mother, you had forgotten about Catherine, Eleanor continued. She said you already had a girlfriend there, and that in your conversations you didn't even ask about Catherine, but only shared happy details of your new life. This seemed quite plausible, and based on her words, I also thought that's how it would all turn out. Catherine returned after that conversation in tears. She was sobbing, begging her mother to move. She wanted to hide. Catherine regretted her action. It was in vain that she went to David's mother then. Nothing good came of it, only trouble. Well, we moved, Eleanor sighed. We settled here, in Severovo. Why not? Nothing kept us in Petrovsk. No place of our own. No good job. So at least in that respect, my daughter and I were free. Catherine wanted so much to hide. She was very afraid that your mother would carry out her threats and take the child. I didn't believe it, of course, but for my daughter's peace of mind, I agreed. And here we are. Mother and daughter quickly settled into the new place. This town was much smaller than Petrovsk, so in some ways, life was even simpler for the small family here. Prices were lower, the atmosphere calmer. Exactly at the appointed time, Stephen was born. A healthy, strong baby. Grandmother and mother doted on the little one. He reciprocated their feelings. It seemed Stephen understood from infancy how difficult things were for his loved ones, and therefore was practically an ideal child. He slept a lot, ate well, didn't fuss, listened to his grandmother and mother. Everything would have been fine, but money was tight for the family. Eleanor and Catherine worked as cleaners. Both earned pennies, which were barely enough for the bare essentials: apartment rent, food, minimal clothing. Stephen had no expensive toys, no gadgets, no fashionable clothes, but he never complained or demanded anything from his mother and grandmother. On the contrary, he assured them that when he grew up, he would buy them everything. Well, we didn't live richly, but we lived happily and peacefully, Eleanor continued her story, tears welling up in her eyes. And then the tragedy. It was with Catherine, like a bolt from the blue. She got sick, didn't go to the doctor, continued to work, went around with a fever, washed floors in cold water. She hid her condition from me until the last moment. I wouldn't have let her go to work, although we desperately needed the money. I noticed when she was already completely bedridden. I called an ambulance, took Catherine to the hospital. It immediately turned out to be bilateral pneumonia, and it was already advanced. They couldn't save her, so Stephen and I were left alone. Eleanor had experienced many losses in her years, but what happened to Catherine hit her the hardest. Perhaps, if not for Stephen, the elderly woman would not have survived. But she needed to remain strong for her grandson. And Eleanor pulled herself together. She worked again, cleaned again, and cooked lunches and dinners, and also supported her grandson, who had also had it tough. Imagine being left without a mother at 8 years old. The old woman's speech flowed smoothly, like a river. David was overwhelmed by various emotions. His heart ached from the fact that Catherine was now lost forever. Yes, he was used to living without her, but David knew she was somewhere, living, feeling something, laughing, maybe even remembering him sometimes. And now it turned out, this is what had happened. But on the other hand, it seemed David had found a son. After all, Stephen, by all accounts, turned out to be his child. His and Catherine's, their continuation, their future. Why didn't Catherine turn to me for help, even in the hardest times? David choked out. She knew where to find me. I didn't hide, and didn't even change my place of residence. I was in Petrovsk the whole time. We were afraid. Eleanor sighed. Your mother. She made it clear that if we made any claims, she would sue for custody of the child. How were we to know that you wouldn't side with her? That's why we hid. How could she think that I... David didn't finish. Tears were overwhelming him, but he didn't want to cry now, on the bench in front of Catherine's mother. Don't judge. Eleanor gently patted the man's shoulder. We were afraid for Stephen, you understand? And fear is a bad advisor. And Catherine was offended at you for a while for finding someone else there. And then later, she often looked at your photos on social media, where you were with different girls. But I didn't have anyone there on the internship, David exclaimed. I worked like Papa Carlo just to earn money for an apartment faster, to live happily and peacefully with Catherine. That's fate for you, Eleanor shook her head. Fate, you know, is quite a trickster. And even now, what was the probability that we would meet here? Practically zero. And yet, here we are sitting on a bench, talking. I want to see my son, David suddenly said. Stephen, yours, he is mine, isn't he? He's yours, Eleanor smiled. You'll see the boy. All doubts will vanish. Grandma, hi, where did you come from? A slightly hoarse boy's voice was heard from behind David. The man turned sharply and saw a tall, thin teenager. It was as if lightning struck him. This child. He was the spitting image of David from his childhood photos, only dressed and haircut differently. The teenager looked at David with disbelief. Here comes Stephen, Eleanor smiled. Finished work already? Yes, that's why I came. They paid me well. Let's go home. You don't need to stand here anymore today. Stephen, it seemed, hadn't yet realized that David wasn't just a random passerby. Wait, Eleanor suddenly hesitated. I want to introduce you to a good person here. This is David. Uncle David. I'm your father, David stated directly, and without any preparation. The words just slipped from his lips. He didn't like this, Uncle David. What kind of uncle was he to Stephen? You... The boy's eyes widened in surprise. His eyebrows shot up to his bangs. Of course, the confession shocked the young man. But somewhere deep in his eyes, a flicker of joy and relief appeared. Several years passed. Eleanor and Stephen now lived in Petrovsk again. David bought them an apartment next to his. More correctly, it should be said that all three of them lived together, as one family. David was still not speaking to his mother. Then, after the chance meeting with Eleanor and meeting Stephen, the man returned to Petrovsk and immediately went to his parent. A long and difficult conversation took place between them. His mother, of course, had not expected such a turn of events. And who could have imagined? She didn't know what had happened to Catherine later. She didn't even care if the child had been born. The woman had believed all these years that she had done the right thing. She had saved her only child from a greedy poor girl, didn't let her ruin her son's fate. At first his mother denied it, didn't want to confess that she had once treated Catherine so disgustingly, and didn't mention the intercepted letters. That old woman told you a pack of lies to foist her grandson on you, and you swallowed it whole. And that boy, the probability that he's your son is minimal. David could have argued a lot against these words. Stephen was his. There was no doubt about that now. David even had an official document confirming his kinship with the boy. The man had ordered a DNA test almost immediately. Not because he doubted anything. Stephen was too much like himself as a child. It was just that this test was needed for official adoption. And David, of course, intended to take Stephen under his wing. The boy had already lived in conditions that weren't quite suitable for a child for so many years. Now that would end. David pleaded with his mother for a long time, then to tell him the truth. She avoided answering, so from the woman's behavior, he guessed everything himself. But then his mother finally broke down. She called Catherine and her Eleanor the worst names. described the prospects of a terrible future for her son if he had tied his fate to that poor girl. David looked at his mother and pressed his lips tightly together. His dearest, closest person. She had devoted her whole life to him, done so much for her only son, helped him make something of himself, and it was his mother, with her own hands, who had destroyed his happiness once. David tried not to think about what would have happened if, upon returning, he had found Catherine in Petrovsk. Stephen would have been about 2 years old then. Of course, they would have gotten married, bought the apartment they had dreamed of, and lived happily. A couple of years later, Stephen would have had a brother or sister. Catherine would have been alive. David hadn't spoken to his mother for about 2 years now, but he wasn't the initiator of this silence. His mother had taken offense at him herself. She was deeply indignant that her son didn't appreciate her contribution to his own future. And she also tried to forbid him, a grown established man, from communicating with Stephen and Eleanor. Upon learning that her son was going to formalize paternity for the boy, the woman became furious. "What are you doing? Have you completely lost your mind? You're going to saddle yourself with your mistress's son, and his grandmother too. How do you know whose he is? Who knows what kind of genes the boy has? It would be better if you married a decent woman with a child, since you want a family so much." She said many unpleasant and angry words about Stephen and Eleanor. David tried to calm his mother, to explain his view of the situation. It was useless. The elderly woman reacted to any mention of her grandson like a bull to a red rag. She lost her temper, became irritated, swore profusely. David felt sorry for his mother, but he wasn't going to abandon his child to satisfy her whims, especially since he and his son had somehow immediately bonded. And so his mother took offense and stopped communicating with David. He periodically made attempts to reconcile. He knew that sooner or later his parent, despite her stubborn character, would soften. And for now he had plenty to do anyway. They had so much to catch up on with Stephen. Son and father now often went on vacation, sometimes to the sea, sometimes to the mountains. The teenager sincerely admired the world around him, eagerly absorbing new impressions. Son and father talked a lot. Stephen turned out to be an interesting and wise interlocutor beyond his years. And now, since the boy didn't have to work, his studies had improved. At the prestigious gymnasium where David had enrolled his son, he quickly became one of the best students. Eleanor was also always nearby. How could it be otherwise? She had raised Stephen for so many years. Grandmother and grandson had become the closest people to each other. Of course, they couldn't be separated. David's personal life also improved. Finally, he met a woman who was interesting and close to him in spirit. She didn't resemble the flighty beauties with whom David often had romances in his past life. Helen worked as an accountant. She was raising a son from her first marriage alone, the same age as Stephen. The boys quickly found common ground. These were the boys, David smiled, watching the teenagers enthusiastically discussing something or repairing a bicycle together. It seemed they would all make a strong, friendly family. Helen immediately became friends with Stephen and with Eleanor too. Peace, harmony, tranquility, mutual support. David felt warm and light in his heart. And his mother would understand everything in time. She herself was already regretting her stubbornness. David noticed this. Sooner or later, his mother would soften. That time was not far off. No one held a grudge against her anymore. Only it was probably difficult for his mother to understand this. Never mind. Everything would work out.